In the previous section, we talked about how to create a line on a graph by plotting points. But there are other ways that we can figure out where that line should go on our graph. One of them is by using slope. So first we need a definition of what slope means. Slope is a ratio. And if you'll remember from the previous sections, the ratio is a comparison of two numbers. So in this case, the two numbers that we're comparing, it is the ratio of the change in y over the change in x. Okay, so how much, you can also think of it of how much the rise, the up and down changes, compared to how much the run, the left to right, changes. And there are lots of different forms that this answer can come in. A positive slope is a slope that looks like this, where if you were running along across this paper, going from left to right, you would be going uphill. So that would be defined as a positive slope. A negative slope is just what it sounds like. If you were continuing to run along from left to right and all of a sudden started going downhill, that is a negative slope. The two that are sometimes a little more confusing to keep straight are the zero and undefined. A slope of 0 means that there isn't a change. It's completely flat ground. So your guy here running along, he went uphill, he went downhill, he just went along flat ground. The slope that our running man cannot run is a slope that looks like this, a slope that is a completely vertical line. So we call that slope undefined. So the different kinds of answers that you might get if you were solving an equation for slope are any real number okay. It can be positive numbers, they can be negative numbers. Lines that have a steep slope like this one might be a positive whole number. A line that doesn't have quite as steep a slope, a more gradual hill, is probably going to have a fraction as its slope. Some examples of these could be a slope of 2 or of -3, a slope of 3/4, a slope of -1/2. Then we get to these, you could even have a slope of 0. And the last kind of slope we can have is the one that we call undefined, and that is the name that is given to the slope that is a slope of a vertical line. So how do we find this slope? Well, you look back up here to the definition where it talked about the change in the rise, the change in the y values, compared to the run, or the change in the x values. So looking at this particular line, we have a point where it crosses the x-axis at this point right here, which is -3, 0. And then up here, it's crossing the y-axis at the point 0, 2. So if I look at how much things have changed here, in order to travel from this point to this point, I needed to go up 2 and then over 3. So the slope of this line would be defined as 2, 3. So that's one way to do it, is just by looking at your graph and counting how many spaces up versus how many spaces over does it take to get from one point to another point on your line. A way to do it mathematically would be to use the slope formula. The slope formula, which says m is the letter that we use for slope, and I actually Googled this to find out why we use m for slope, and found all sorts of very interesting ideas of what it might be, none of them confirmed. So m is slope, because mathematicians are crazy. That's the best answer I found. So slope says we're going to use the letter m, and it's the change in the y values. So you're going to take one of your y values and another of your y values and subtract them, because that's how we figure out how much it changed, what the difference is between the two. And you're going to put that number over the x values for that same point, for point 1, over the x values for point 2. So looking at this line that we just figured out, our y values were a 2 and a 0. So 2 minus 0. And that means that I'm letting this be 0.1 and this be 0.2. And it looks like the changes of our x values in that is a 0, watch your signs here, minus a negative 3. So this minus is not that negative. It's minus and then the number after it. So those are going to end up turning into a positive 3. And this 2 minus 0 is still a 2. So we end up finding the same slope with the formula that we found by looking at the picture. Vertical lines, when we try to do that, the reason that the slope is undefined is that when we find the difference in our x values, they end up being a 0, because the x values in a vertical line, like the line x equals 3, the x value is always going to be 3, leaving the bottom of our fraction as a 0. And since we can't have zeros in the denominators of our fractions, we would describe that slope as being undefined. Horizontal lines, the ones where the y values don't change, x might have different values, but the y value is always going to come out to be 0. So, since we can have fractions that have zeros in the numerator, they just end up equaling 0, we say that our slope is 0.